Yancey, welcome here with us. We are very, very glad to have you here, especially because you're not just an entrepreneur and founder of a great company, which we all know. As we can say a few words about the Yancey. If you haven't heard about Yancey, the company, Yancey is the co-founder of Kickstarter, and Kickstarter, not just a co-founder but also former CEO. And Kickstarter have helped over 180,000 projects raise almost $5 billion to date. And projects like Oculus Rift and some other very well-known projects started actually on Kickstarter. And Yancey also recently wrote this book, and the book is called This Could Be Our Future. So hopefully we also gonna talk about this book. Yancey, welcome. And can we hear you? Yes, you're here.
Yeah.
You have great sound.
Marveling at all the tabs in that browser we were just looking at. A lot of tabs. Yeah.
Yes,
How you doing?
Yeah. I'm doing fine. I'm a little bit sad that this is the book which will be also just written, and I didn't really get to have it signed by you because you came kindly to our conference in February.
Yeah.
And the line was just too long, so I just couldn't wait for you to sign.
That was one of those. Yeah, that was one of those strange. It was a very long line, and it was one of those situations where I think people got in a line because there was a line, and they thought there must be something interesting at the front of it, and instead there was me, and I was very grateful. But yeah, that was a surreal experience.
It was great. It was really great. I loved it. And I also heard your talk there, and that's actually how we connected. So thank you for your time to be here. Where are you dialing in from now?
I'm in Vancouver, Canada.
Ah, nice. Yeah. So you are in the Pacific time zone.
Yeah.
So it's the morning for you. And originally you are from Virginia, right? West Virginia.
Yeah, I grew up on a farm in rural Virginia, and basically lived there until I went to college. And then after university, I moved to New York City. My dream growing up was always to be a writer. Growing up in the middle of nowhere, no neighbors, just books were my only friend, and moved to New York to pursue a career as a journalist, and made a living writing about music, mostly for places like the Village Voice and Spin magazine for about 10 years. Mm-hmm. And started a record label. But during that time, met a gentleman named Perry Chen. We became great friends, and he had the idea for crowdfunding about 3 years.
But all of you just throw it out there. How do you start a record label? Come on, this is
how do I start a record label?
Just pass by.
Yeah, well, that was interesting. That was my day job then was at a company called eMusic, which was the first digital music store, first place MP3 was ever sold. And when I joined, it was 2004, and the company had become a subscription music service, one of the first subscription music services. Yeah. At the time, I was just going to shows all the time and seeing young bands who were selling CDRs at the show, just like home burned things of their 5 songs. And I would always buy those. And there were so many great things in New York. The New York music scene was so great. So at eMusic, I said, hey, we should create the first digital music label and create our own imprint where we release records on our own and we distribute them to all the services. And so I did this, and we created agreements where we got no ownership of the work. The company took no money in sales. All the sales went to the artists. And we started putting out 2 records a month that way, and put out some amazing albums. I'm still very proud of that. But it was also interesting because I was quite a few of the artists that we signed went on to sign with much bigger labels.
Yes.
And the amount of money that they were making in these direct deals was quite significant. Like one of the first records we put out, the band got a check for like $45,000 a couple months later, which was just amazing. Wow. And then bigger labels went to sign, and they could see that they would probably make less money with a bigger label than doing things direct. But one thing I learned then was how important for these artists, it was to be signed by a label and to have the social validation of a gatekeeper like a record label approving you as a musician. And for those folks, it's like for their families or their significant others, maybe people in their lives who maybe doubt their path, or they just want to demonstrate the realness of their path, that piece of paper of having a record contract is so significant. And so I was always really motivated by that with Kickstarter, just the power of social validation and the notion of like, well, what if it's not just a gatekeeper that can provide that kind of validation to someone to say that their hobby is legitimate, and more than a hobby, it's like a real thing. What if people can do that for each other? So that whole experience was fascinating, and yeah, put out a lot of great records too.
And how much did you learn about building a community and the following? Because I'm sure this was an important aspect of the whole process, also for Kickstarter.
Yeah. Well, I've always, since like the 90s, I've always been a message board person on the internet. Like I haven't in the last 12 years, but for many, many years, I was just very active on a number of boards. And so just had a lot of just comfort with talking to people on the internet. And eMusic was actually interesting in that it had a very active forum, and I think still does, even as being a paid service. And, you would talk to customers, you just very engaged. So, I've always had a high degree of comfort with internet communication. And, for the creative community, especially in the early days of Kickstarter, it's interesting because at that point, it was a relatively small number of artists and creative people who were really embracing the internet, who were good at it. And so really by having relationships with, a dozen people or so who are sort of straddle that world between web culture and traditional artistic culture, you're really like talking to a lot of the more influential people. That world's a lot bigger now. But, we always grew in a very organic community first kind of way. I mean, at the very beginning with Kickstarter, we made it to where you had to have an invitation to start a project. And we, just wanted to define the culture very specifically around creative projects and a certain kind of creative community.
Interesting. So let's dive into Kickstarter. Before we do, let me just share the screen, and I want to give the opportunity to the audience to ask questions. So the audience, all you have to do is just open your mobile and open the camera and point it to the QR code. And a link will pop up. This is Slido. And you can just ask away. So whatever you want to know, feel free to ask. We already have some questions there, so we'll be asking. I can promise you the most interesting questions we will ask, Yancey. And which ones you can decide, because you have the option to like questions which you want to be asked. So this is the slide out of the way. Now let's dive in. So yes, you moved to New York, and then you became friends with your other co-founder who had the idea for Kickstarter. What made you think that this is something which is important to do, because there were other projects already alive, right?
Well, I think a lot of what we connected on was that for an artist trying to get funding for a project, you were generally pitching like an executive, a business person who was looking to put money into projects that were likely to produce a financial return. Yes. And that just like very greatly shrunk the idea, the possible projects that are worth funding. And what you would find is that creative people would conform their project to meet more of the financial expectations, to try to like get that green light. Everyone's trying to get that green light. And so the notion of like, well, what if we create a separate economy where projects are funded just because fans want their favorite artists to keep doing their thing. And it doesn't matter, its commercial appeal doesn't matter, it just matters whether it appeals to their fan base. And the idea that artists should be able to speak directly to fans and to be able to create directly with fans was a new idea. That was a new idea. That was not something that existed. Maybe, there were things like Jill Sobule has created a one-off site, a band called Marillion and created a one-off site. There were a few experiments, but no one had really made that normal. And no one had even defined like a creator as being a user profile type, right? Creative people were not thought of as like a category to build tools for. You know, those were all very segmented. You had painters, you had musicians, you had filmmakers. There were different schools. There were very few tools they all used that were same, other than like Mac computers. So even like defining the word creator as what a Kickstarter creator should be called, that took years of debate. And we felt very uncomfortable with that phrase. Creator sounded too godlike to our mind because that was how that word was used before.
That's funny, yeah.
But now that's just like such a normal nothing phrase. You know, YouTube talks about it like it's always been there. But I truly think before Kickstarter like sort of defined this as like creative pursuits, works that involve an audience, that these are things that really became a lot more structured through the existence of the platform.
So at the beginning, there were some crowdfunding projects already available for little niches. And then you come along, and you know, when I was thinking about some interesting analogies, MP3 existed before, right? And then iPod came along, and then it just redefined the market. And I feel like when I remember how the situation was at the beginning, and if I'm not mistaken, you are now celebrating 11th birthday, right?
Yeah,
this
that's
month.
right.
And so it was super quickly. Kickstarter became the brand for crowdfunding. And then a few years later, there were like 2,000 or 3,000 other platforms. Can you tell us, while being in the middle of the whole thing, what did you feel were the key decisions which you made, which made Kickstarter stand out so much?
Well, I think first and foremost was just a very limited scope from the beginning. You know, we didn't want to be everything to everybody. We focused just on creative projects, and we turned down projects. I mean, you have to manually apply to start a project. During the first 5 years, it was a human being would read your proposal, and we read hundreds of thousands of them and turned down many. And so there's a lot of work that went into creating a site that had a very specific culture around fundraising. It wasn't about guilt. It wasn't about get a great return on your investment. It was about the excitement of new ideas, people coming together, and really trying to create that culture. But you know, it was it's fascinating because the validation of the platform happened sort of community by community. Like people would use it, would share it with their backers. Other people in the community of, say, product designers or dancers or choreographers would see this as a tool that's available, and it slowly expanded its way out through there. And you know, soon other platforms started, and there was a period. You know, the one thing that was frustrating was that every other crowdfunding site just copied everything about Kickstarter, copied the design, the language. And there was like a year of being constantly frustrated by that. You know, every time we would do something, we would just have to wait 72 hours to watch every other site copy it.
Oh, really? Was it so bad?
Yeah, well, just there were periods where it was just people just so closely mirrored what we were doing. But eventually just can't, you know, but one thing that was good for us is that we never focused all that much on competition, didn't obsess so much on that, obsessed more on having credibility with the creative community, just feeling like that's the audience that matters.
Yes.
And it's just very easy to get distracted by those kinds of things. But we also, you know, by defining a limited scope of saying only creative projects, not charitable projects, not investment, not generic business funding.
Well, let's stay here for a bit, because what you did is very smartly is the way how after you reached the first, I think, were 2 projects which reached over 1 million very quickly, and one of them I think within 72 hours. This game designer. You also wanted to make a statement to make sure people don't misuse the platform for something which they don't plan to then deliver. And you made your rules stricter. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, it was 2012, about 3 years in. The first 2 projects crossed $1 million in funding on the same day. One had launched just the day before. And then from that point on, it was like a new $1 million project every week on the site in almost all categories. And but we came to feel that people were actually putting too much trust in the platform. You know, we'd always been so careful in policing it in certain ways around sort of like taste, but people we thought were putting too much trust in projects as a result. And also projects were, you know, our rules had been fairly open and fairly broad because we thought we want you to tell your story, but we began to feel like people were exploiting those rules, and that especially that people were raising a lot of money without showing much of anything. So even in the midst of this, we launched an announcement called Kickstarter is not a store, which laid out new restrictions and basically raised the bar for what it took to launch a project in a couple categories in particular. And it was a very unpopular decision. I mean, the post has 500 some comments and almost all of them some variation of FU. And but yet we were certain that it was what we had to do, that to maintain the trust in the platform over the longer term, you have to be willing to give some of this up and to try to just set clearer lines. Now, this doesn't stop failures from happening. And this is still a trust-based system. But we did work with the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, and they did an enormous study, the largest study of crowdfunding outcomes. And they looked at 50,000 some Kickstarter projects, and they found that 9% of the time projects fail to deliver as promised. 90% of the time they do. But about 1 out of 10, they fail. And the most common reasons projects failed were the project was harder than people thought, issues between co-founders, lost interest in the project, you know, things like that. Very, very human kind of thing. So it works phenomenally well for being a trust-based system. And I think a lot of it is people want to fulfill the obligations of their backers. You know, there's a strong social incentive to be a good actor and a lot of disincentive for being a bad actor. Those people still exist. And, you know, as a platform, you're trying to set high enough bars or force enough transparency that those bad actors sort of reveal themselves.
Yes. And you also made some rules which are interesting. You made no bummers, or you decided to explain to people that charity is for other platforms like GoFundMe, so you wouldn't charity, just creative projects. Why did you go for the no bummers policy?
Yeah, this was just an informal rule that my partner and I had in the first year of what projects to let in. You know, in 2009 when Kickstarter launched, there was no online fundraising. Like that really didn't happen. Maybe like the Obama campaign was online fundraising, but typically online fundraising was people starving somewhere that need help. It was about guilt. So for the culture of the site, our first kind of rule was no bummers, nothing depressing, nothing that plays on guilt. Because we saw that as being incompatible with a platform meant for creative projects. And yeah, GoFundMe launched 2 years after Kickstarter. They were one of those sites that copied Kickstarter's design. And, you know, but we always saw that like the charitable market will be huge, but that is not, a charitable market can't coexist with a creative place. Like those are just such different energies. And if you're asking someone whether they should fund a project giving aid to people starving or to fund a book of poetry, the book of poetry is always going to lose. This is the reason why Walmart doesn't put like TVs next to, you know, help this starving person. Your brain breaks with the dissonance of those two choices. And so we wanted to have a space focused just on creativity.
I understand. Now, early on, you did some campaigns and some interesting projects were starting to be born on the platform, like Oculus, for example. Can you mention a few other things which you are especially proud of, which were born on Kickstarter?
Yeah. One is this right behind me, the transparent speaker. That's a great stereo from a group called People.
Are you still using it?
Yeah, it's amazing product. The Peloton started as a Kickstarter project. Cards Against Humanity began on Kickstarter. The film that won the best documentary short at the Oscars this year, Hair Love, was a Kickstarter project. You know, there's a lot of different things. It's close to, you know, I think you said beforehand, 180,000 projects funded at this point. So I don't know. I'm in a room surrounded by Kickstarter rewards. I have a lot of them in my house hanging on my wall.
That's very cool.
But yeah, just amazing artists, and
Uh-huh.
things that wouldn't exist
Let's look
otherwise.
at some questions from Slido. So we have a question from Peter. He wants to know whether Kickstarter is what you envisioned at the beginning today. So when you look back, is Kickstarter today what you thought it would be?
It's amazingly hard to remember what I thought. In the same way, like when you have a child, you think, I'll never forget this moment, and 6 months later, you have zero memory of it. So I don't remember exactly what I thought. I mean, when we launched, my personal goal was to have one project funded in the first month. I thought if that happens, that's like something happened that wouldn't otherwise. That seems successful. You know, the first project was funded after like 3 days. But yeah, I think it is about what I thought. You know, I think maybe what I would have pictured in my most ambitious would be more bigger artists opening themselves up to working directly with their fan bases. But I also understand the reasons why people want those layers of abstraction between themselves and sort of the responsibilities to their audience. It is a lot to carry.
It is certainly. Now, you also had a show at the London's Victoria and Albert Museum about Kickstarter design projects.
Yeah.
Do you remember the show? And
yeah.
Tell us something about it.
Yeah, I mean, it was the London Design Museum, and it was, at the time, there had just been a show at MoMA that had displayed multiple Kickstarter projects, like a great mapping project of hip hop lyrics. I forget what all was in the MoMA. And so the Design Museum followed that up by doing an exhibit of like 30 things made by, sort of everyday people. I mean, these were, designers in various capacities, but a beautiful display of just great objects, great projects created to the site. Maybe 2 years ago, I could have told you the list of everything that was a part of it. But there have been, quite a few major works that have been funded that way. I mean, Ai Weiwei has done multiple Kickstarter projects for installations around the world. And the Smithsonian Institute has done multiple projects. So, working with institutions has always been exciting, and I'm kind of an institutionalist myself. I believe in those kinds of things. So
yes.
We like working with them.
You made Kickstarter profitable within 14 months, which is kind of hard to, if you think about the today's climate where, all big companies need to raise VC money. You didn't. And you not only didn't raise money, you also claimed publicly that Kickstarter is not going to be a company which is which is going to be here for aggressive money making. And did you reinstate the company as another entity? Tell us about that.
So the company we did start operating in the black in our 14th month. We were able to do that for two reasons. One, we always stayed small. Like that was always a focal point. After a year, I think we had 7 employees, including the founders. So like just staying lean. And we saw, and also we have a revenue source, and that money moves to the site, and we just took a simple 5% fee. But, we always thought about the importance of profitability a few different ways. One is that it protects your decision-making. Like it's hard to make good decisions consistently. It's especially hard if you are carrying an emotional weight. It's very hard to think clearly. And so for us, like just to be sustainable is a way to be able to operate with a little bit of a clear head, to not have to operate from a place of fear. We did raise money. We have angel investors, who are mostly friends and family.
How much have you raised?
And artists. And then we did a Series A shortly after we launched from Union Square Ventures and Fred Wilson, and then a few angels. But that was less than $1 million total. And it was based on that we got to profitability. And there was a small amounts of money raised later for part of like buying a building, things like that. But really, the company got to profitability and growth, on less than $1 million. And just, we have always the company has always maintained this mindset of trying to stay small. There is the power of getting bigger is that you can have a larger impact. The challenge is there's more overhead. The challenge is that you are then requiring yourself to grow. And then maybe you find yourself trapped in situations where sort of all decisions are like you're reverse engineering your way to a financial outcome that you need to hit. And this is when you start to make decisions that damage your reputation, and that cause people to look elsewhere. And so that we're always trying to protect against those things. Like the goal was, and still is, long-term meaningfulness, to still be a relevant, useful tool to the creative community, for as long as the company could possibly be that. And that is success.
Okay. You already mentioned a few projects which were born on the site. Can you tell us about the why some founders did not make it? And you have this rule of all or nothing. So if you don't raise the money which you're aiming for, you're not going to get anything. And tell us why do you have this rule? And what are the key common mistakes you saw founders making on the site?
Well, we thought it would be a powerful motivator to act, that all or nothing would make it kind of like a game, kind of interesting. Will this project make it or won't it? It's kind of up to all of us together. So we imagine that as being a galvanizing kind of energy. And also it would protect creators from having an insufficient budget. You're expected to complete a project. It's going to take a certain amount. But if you're trying to complete it with half that amount, you're kind of in the worst possible position. The one dynamic we found that was amazing is that for projects that reach 30% of their funding goal, succeed over 90% of the time. So really every project, the outcomes truly are all or nothing. You either reach your goal or nobody cares is generally where things end up. The percentage of projects that get close and don't make it is extraordinarily small. And so what happens is that it just motivates people to engage. And it also underlies the uniqueness of the Kickstarter system. The idea that everyone has to collectively come together to basically finance this thing into existence is a clear reminder that this is not a store. This is not a normal kinds of transaction. So we've always seen it as being important and just a big part of protecting the integrity of the platform and the outcomes. And I think part of why 90% of funded projects do end up delivering. But it's a limitation in other ways. But I think these kinds of constraints are good for, generating maybe actions that wouldn't have happened otherwise.
Any mistakes you did see founders make on the platform? The most common ones?
I think it's just, the biggest mistake people make is just not telling people. But it's hard to tell people, right? It's hard to tell people in a way that's interesting. The internet is so noisy and so competitive. So, there is absolutely an audience on Kickstarter that's looking for projects to back. I think about 40%, last I knew, about 40% of pledges are from people that are like looking for projects on the site. But those people tend to pile on to projects that are already having success. So if you're launching just thinking, okay, there's this great community, they're going to love what I'm going to do. That community does exist, but you generally have to validate yourself with your own network first before any of those people start getting involved. So I think it's just assuming people will come is probably the biggest mistake.
Yes. Some projects had the opposite problem, like the Pebble Watch, for example, which was the first smartwatch. And some might argue the company was just too fast, too soon on the market because it was a great project, broke some records on the platform, raised some money. They made it live, but then Apple Watch came and maybe overtook the market. What do you draw from these kind of experiences for the future success of your founders? How do you bring those insights to them?
Well, I mean, I think the challenge of competing with corporate giants is enormous. It's a fact that in the United States, in the past 40 years, entrepreneurship rates are half of what they were in the 1970s per capita. It's never been harder to start a small business, to start a company, because the competition is so significant. You can imagine in other eras, Pebble could have slowly built out that audience. I mean, they had over 1 million active Pebble wearers, and they made truly a great product. But yeah, it's very hard to compete against $1 trillion company that steps into your market, especially one as skilled as Apple. It is a difficult time. It is a difficult time to have a small company. I think your best options are to be a barnacle on a larger ship, be a feature on someone else's product that you hope you can carve off enough of a spot that they don't, try to copy you, take you on.
Yes.
Or it's you create a mid-sized business, which is kind of what Kickstarter is, to where it's not, the addressable market isn't large enough to be worth a bigger player moving into it. I'm sure a lot of these bigger companies at the moment when Kickstarter was at its like frothiest and hypiest, toyed with the idea of, oh, should we start a crowdfunding platform? Should we do crowdfunding? Hey, here seems like a new thing of activity. Should we copy this? And Facebook, in fact, did. They did that for causes, right, with GoFundMe. But like, we wouldn't want that to happen. We like the market staying at such a size that it's just supporting the creative community. Not a ton of money is pouring into it to try to, take it. But crowdfunding did have that era. There was a 2-month period of time where 2 of our competitors in the space raised over $60 million from the, most AAA VC firms trying to take down Kickstarter, because it was like, hey, here's a market to try to own. And this has been the mentality of tech. You try to buy markets through spend, through buying up supply, things like that. But for a market like this, it's just not big enough to be worth it. And so I think that's a challenge a lot of entrepreneurs face.
It is, but in terms of Kickstarter, you also had a big, strong brand, which was quite well executed. So people instantly remembered the brand for those creative projects, and it just kind of stays in the minds.
Yeah, but that took 3 or 4 years to establish. 3 or 4 years of being very specific about what we would be and wouldn't be, and that took time. That took time to earn. But the lesson I would take from this is that I think it was the specific focus of Kickstarter that allowed its success. So if you're starting a platform, and keep in mind, like, we're inventing a new space with crowdfunding and still focused on a specific area. So if you're creating a startup that's introducing a new paradigm, a new type of exchange, it still makes sense to start in a very focused way, in a defensible market and an addressable market. Where you can tailor your product. And if it works, you can expand later if you feel that's right. But the more specific the itch you scratch, the better your chances.
I fully agree. Nobody wants to be everything to everybody, because if you conquer a small niche first and then expand from that, it's much easier and simpler than if you're just trying to please everybody. It doesn't work. We have a question here from. I saw a question here quite interesting from Rish Cabra, and he wants to know: do you worry that projects with traditional sources of funding, such as VC, nevertheless use Kickstarter as a source of cheap funding / marketing?
It has happened. It's I think that the way platforms professionalize as they become more successful is an interesting challenge, right? Like, more people start looking at Kickstarter, thus more people want to be on Kickstarter, thus people start to hire professional people to make their videos as a way to stand out more. And suddenly there's kind of this race to the top. And it's cool in some ways, but in the other ways, it sort of seems to block out a lot of, say, what had success early on. The Apple App Store is a great example. If you think about the kinds of games that went viral, Flappy Bird, that is a less mature app store where that happens, where it's still wide open in that kind of way. And eventually enough money pours in that it starts to buy and carve out the market. So I think there have been attempts to do that on Kickstarter. Some projects launch that have some funding. We toyed at various moments with like trying to police that. Do you police that? But then that becomes a very strange set of questions. Can we see who supported you before? Like, Does that mean you have to be needy to be on Kickstarter? What if you just want to engage? So in the end, it just seemed like if the internet wants to, shame some project because they think it's not genuine enough, then by all means do it. And like the creator will have to, explain themselves, defend it. But to prohibit projects because they've gotten funding before, in the end, didn't feel like it was a battle worth fighting.
Yes. At the beginning, when you started Kickstarter, you had certain company culture. And then Kickstarter evolved, became more famous. How did the company culture evolve over time?
Yeah, it just gets harder. Early on, it's, of course, it's informal. You start to reach levels, basically around 50 or 60 people, there was a new need for structure. And those are moments that are easy to get wrong, because this can lead you to say, it can lead to early contributors seeming less relevant to the current and future needs of the organization, because early on you have a lot of like Swiss Army people who can do a lot of things. As you go, you need more specialized people. That moment of like sort of professionalization is when you start to look outside for leaders, which is a very mixed bag. I think that, I think by and large, we did a fairly good job at this. But it's really not easy. I mean, the goal I was always working towards as a leader was an organization where everyone was so clear on what we were doing and what a good and bad outcome was, that you're almost functioning in like a post-permission kind of organization and environment where, what matters is so clear that everyone has the green light to act in ways to support that. That was what I was always trying to work towards. I didn't feel like I quite got there. But that I think is still the ultimate state for any organization, because and you only get there by clearly expressing values and priorities in a way that everyone is empowered to act on them. And this is important because without written values, without a written express strategy, there's no way for people lower on the totem pole to say, call out leaders who they think are making poor decisions. Without things written down, the existing power structure of the organization will always prevail. You'll just fall back to that default of whoever gets paid the most. It's whatever they want happens that happens. That can work for a lot of the time, but I think to have consistent greatness, I think you need to build an organization that can sort of think on its own. And so that's a project that I'm very interested in now. And I coach a select number of CEOs and advise companies, and really working specifically on this idea of creating a deep level of organizational coherence to where everything you're doing just matches up and lines up with who you are and what you want to be. And that is when organizations are their most impactful.
Yes. When I follow Kickstarter for over the years, I really like that there's this consistency of values in Kickstarter, whatever you're doing. Tell us a few examples of the crossroads where you ended up and you decided you don't want to go this way. What were the warning signs?
Well, I think like the clearest moments came during crises. I could think of 3 or 4 crises. One is the one with like blockbuster projects happening. Another was a project with some objectionable material, and there were protesters outside of our door. There's a couple moments where basically our values are really put to the test. What do we think creative expression means? Like, what does it mean to be an open platform? Decisions about whether to raise money, or decisions about the long-term interest of the company. Like, what is success for us? And it's only in those kind of crisis moments that you really confront that deeper level. Like, I've written a lot about this, I visualize values as being like a tech stack where they're like sort of components built on top of each other. And at the deepest level of values are moral beliefs. We express moral beliefs as rules of like, here's what you shouldn't do. And then we also create incentives to create like the positive version of rules. Here's what you should do. during normal times, everyone's focused on incentives and rules, but in crises, the way you know you're in a crisis is that the incentives and rules no longer apply. Like the situation is so different. And this is where you have to go to this moral level of asking what's right. So in those moments of like, someone puts up a project that ends up being quite objectionable and we hadn't realized it, that you are really forced to put those values to the test. And I came to love crises in a strange way, because it was an opportunity to really show who you were. And we learned that the deeper you went in being willing to make sacrifices in a crisis, routinely I found that sacrifice was the one thing that would sort of like propel you out of a crisis, give you credit for the crisis, and sort of put it behind you, allow it to be like a growing a growth moment, and not like some ugly badge that gets hung around your neck from then on. And part of it is just like, it's very easy to make empty statements, apologizing. It's very easy to do a lot of bullshit that doesn't mean anything. But when people see a company say, give up money, give up a part of their business, open themselves up in a way that seems unexpected, as we did with like different researchers around questions of failure, those are things that build trust, because they are not purely self-interested, right? These are ways that you're trying to seek a greater truth. You're trying to be honest about things. And we did reclassify Kickstarter as a public benefit corporation, which is a legal structure that requires the company to balance shareholder interest with producing a positive benefit to society. And that happened while I was CEO, and like that was very active in my mind for me as a leader. Like I really wanted to conduct ourselves as if we are a company that existed for the public benefit. So the accountability should be that broad. And so that definitely created a different mentality of what it meant to like take accountability for your actions, and how to think about what others might call the quote externalities of their business. And so, yeah, it's a different mentality, and I'm glad to see one that's still growing.
Yes. So it's a beautiful project. You helped build loads of interesting activities, and from movies to design projects all the way to books. As you said, you started as a writer. At some point, you decided it's time to move on, and as a CEO, you decided to move on, to go back to writing. Why did you decide to write this book in particular?
Well, for me as like a creative person who didn't intend to be an entrepreneur, but was sort of compelled by an idea, by a life experience, I always had a high degree of self-awareness and a high degree of like imposter syndrome while being in these roles. And that was interesting to have while being, the head of a very famous company, and knowing the heads of other famous companies, and just sort of like being in that world while also very much in my mind, not feeling like I'm a part of that world, not even wanting to be a part of it. And so that I found that when I would give talks, and I would try to explain the way I saw things, in particular, explain some of the root assumptions that I thought were guiding how organizations made decisions. I found that people really connected with the way I explained these things, that I could talk about these ideas that were harder to see in a way that people could really feel. And so when I wrote this book, there was really an emotion I wanted people to experience. I wanted people to understand that the world around us was created more recently than we realize, that it's changing all the time, and that our ability to evolve the world towards a place dramatically better than where it is now is like right in front of us. And to make a very optimistic argument for sort of the way we've been trapped by a limited concept of self-interest, where we visualize self-interest as what I want to need right now. We like a hockey stick graph, a chart of a line sloping up and to the right is how we tend to visualize this. But in reality, our self-interest is actually multidimensional. It's now me, it's future me, the person we want to become. It's now us, the people we rely on and who rely on us, and future us, our children if we have them, or everybody else's children too.
Give an example
And
from
so,
your life. So in your case, what was your future you which you wanted to become?
well, I mean, for my future me is, I picture him as like my Obi-Wan Kenobi, my future Obi-Wan Kenobi. He's standing on the cliffs of time with like salt and pepper hair. He's very wise, and yeah, that's a voice that reminds me of the most important values for me. The two things that he tells me is don't sell out. That's been a real theme in my life. Don't abandon my values for financial reasons. And also to create harmony. I'm a child of divorce, so like bringing people together has always been a strong impulse. But I create weekly rituals. I do them on Zoom with groups of people, where we consult this thing called the bento. It's a framework, a simple 2x2 framework for seeing beyond near-term orientation, a way to see beyond now me, and to actually see the full spectrum of where your choices have an impact. And so the book argues, and I just deeply, deeply believe that our world today is trapped by a limited definition of self-interest. We're all just going around thinking this like interrogation booth of now me is all that is in our self-interest, when in reality our self-interest is multidimensional. And learning that and having a tool, a user interface like bentoism, to make decisions and to see where it is that we operate, is transformational, and it's going to happen. In 30 years, everyone is going to see the world this way. We will all be able to see the rationality and realness of our future selves, of our collective selves, and we will learn how to make decisions taking these things into consideration. And so I'm on a quest to try to create a new language of understanding and better choices as a result.
You mentioned this concept of bentoism. Explain to us, what do you mean by that?
Can I share my? No, I don't have screen sharing. So this is a concept that I created. Bento is an acronym for Beyond Near-Term Orientation, but it's a simple 2x2 matrix. You can picture 4 boxes. In the bottom left is now me, what I want and need right now. In the bottom right is future me, what the older, wiser version of me wants me to do. In the top left is now us, my friends, my family, the people I care about. In the top right is future us. Now these 4 boxes together are like a bento box, the Japanese packed meal. And the beauty of the bento box is that it has 4 compartments and a lid. So it lets you carry a variety of things, a diversity of dishes. And the bento honors a Japanese dieting philosophy called harahachi bu, which says the goal of a meal is to be 80% full. That way you're still hungry for tomorrow. And so bentoism is the same idea, but for our self-interest and our choices, a way to operate and make decisions, not just optimizing for now me, what I want and need right now, but to consider the whole spectrum of your self-interest. And so it's a UI. It's a UI for making decisions. So there's a website, bentoism.org, that guides you through the process of building out your bento. And then I teach workshops for individuals and for organizations that teaches you how to develop your values, how to know what it is that you care about in each of those spaces, and then to make, a word I use a lot, to make coherent decisions, to act in a way that is in deep harmony with who you are, who you want to be, and who others expect you to be. And when we make choices and act in those kinds of ways, like the amplification of what we do is enormous. This is when we have our greatest impact. It's hard to know how to do that. It's hard to know how to do that. We all have our perfect swings every now and then, but to do it consistently is difficult. And so the bento is a user interface. It's a user interface for better decisions, and it's phenomenal.
I have to say that your timing for this book was perfect, because you spoke at a conference in February. Literally, like a week or two later, the world got shut down. And if you look now at people who are self-isolating, we all had time to think about a little bit about where we headed, what does our future hold. And you make the argument that our future needs to become more generous. Tell us, what do you mean by that?
I just mean expanding how we see self-interest, like a world in which we're just all expected to go get yours. It is not going to reach our full potential. right? It will work. It will work in some ways, and the strong will do the best, whatever. But that's not our full capacity. And so, to me, generous is just simply seeing our self-interest for what it is. Once you begin to look at things through this lens, and I think about it as expanding the perimeter of my self-interest from just now me, to consider my future self, to try to anticipate what's coming, and to more actively integrate the people that I care about. Having done this now every day for 3 years, it's like beyond obvious how true it is that these spaces are real, that my life suffers when I fail to think about those things. When I feel most disappointed in myself is when I fail to consider all of these things, which we do all the time, because it's not easy. It takes effort, it takes energy, and life is hard. And life is hard. And so we need a tool to do that. And so, like I could spend hours on what I think the changes are that happen as a result of that. But I think that if we begin to all believe that actually decisions should be filtered not through just this lens of what we want right now, but actually multiple lenses, our choices look very, very different.
Okay. Do you feel like now, throughout this pandemic crisis, your message is coming through to people much faster or more efficiently now that people really have time to sit back and think about where we're headed?
Yeah, I think everyone is having a lot of existential questioning about what is their life. In the world before COVID, like a successful life was a compartmentalized life. You have your professional self, your family self, your work self, your friend self, your secret self, your animal self, whatever all those different roles are. And we had the geography of commutes and just the hustle and bustle of life to transition between them. Instead, we're now all locked in with whatever our contradictions are. Before COVID, I was, having to argue to people that our notion of self-interest was limited. And I was on CNBC fighting with hosts who argued that this was not real. The idea that we overemphasize financial value to the detriment of other values was ridiculous. What I found since COVID is the amount of inbound interest is extreme. That people really connect with this idea very deeply and are looking for something. Because what's happened is we're in an existential crisis of a paradigm shift of the world no longer working the way that we're told it's supposed to work. And so what does that mean? Does that mean that we have to wait for the world to start working again? Does that mean the world has fundamentally changed? Do we have to change? It's not clear. And so in a moment like that, we go looking for, anyone or anything that seems to have anticipated this in any kind of way. And absolutely, Bentoism and the entire philosophy of the book is just all about this moment. I mean, all about this moment. And
very
so,
timely.
Yeah. So now I have these weekly Sundays and now starting next week, Mondays too. I do a weekly bento gathering where, about this number of people get onto a Zoom call, and together we journal and do exercises together to make our priorities, to create to-do lists, to create accountability with one another. If people want to join, you could just go to bit.ly/weekly bento and just drop your email address. I send out invites on Thursday nights for the next week.
That's useful. We share with the audience. Let's look at some questions from Slido. We have last 10 minutes to talk about. We have a question here. Somebody who wants to stay anonymous wants to know, what is your top challenge right now?
Well, it's how to have impact, actually. The right ways to have impact. I'm in a position of advising some interesting startups, and I'm now I think likely moving into a position of advising some of the largest, most important companies in the world potentially, and that's a new kind of role for me, to be more of an advisor, thought partner than a doer, and so I'm trying to wrap my head around that. But I've really focused my energy on 3 challenges. One is expanding self-interest. That's what the book is about. That's what Bentoism is about. The second is defining value and metrics. I believe once our self-interest is expanded, then the need to create new systems of value, new metrics for tracking what we're doing, its effectiveness or ineffectiveness is incredibly important. And the third area is new ownership structures. I think more equitable ownership of platforms is critical, and I'm a part of a co-op that is bringing that to the internet, and I think that's an interesting model. So I'm focused on like, what do I do to have an impact, to try to manifest the world that I want, and it's interesting. It's difficult to know. But one thing that has been exciting is there has been a natural momentum around bentoism. There's a real community of people. There's a Slack group. I'm actually surrounded by people who are quite supportive and are a part of this now. But it's uncharted territory, right? We're really moving into a space of as a society, uncharted territory. And for me, trying to shift our mentality into a place that it hasn't been before.
It's good to see that you're still giving back to the community and advising and helping upcoming founders as well as established companies. We have a question here from Sergey Golubev, and he wants to know, would you do anything different if you were to create Kickstarter again? Knowing what you know now, also being an advisor to other founders, how would you proceed differently today?
I think if I were starting today, I would make the company a co-op. And as a co-op, as a web-based co-op like Ampled, the company I advise, all the creators on the platform and all the backers of certain levels and the people who built it, they would all co-own and co-manage the system, the community. Now, I think that is like long-term, just like the most defensible position to be, especially for a community-driven platform where everyone collectively owns it and guides it together. Because I think one thing that this current crisis is showing us is that the people who own stocks are becoming wealthier. And that's the top 10% of America for the most part. And those people are owners. They're owners of companies. And so even as we're being told, like, this is potentially a new Great Depression, Great Recession, whatever you want to call it, we also know that's not true, that's true for like 80% of people who don't own anything. But for the top 10%, we know that's not true. Actually, they're making more money than ever. So the inequality of this crisis is going to become hard to ignore. And I think that ownership will become a focal point. So to me, like the right way to start a company today is to make it to where ownership is equitable right from the beginning. Because weirdly, like, if someone started a social network whose core offering was we all collectively own it and decide what happens, that's a position that Facebook is structurally incapable of competing with, right? Like maybe you create a Libra crypto hedge as a way to like do that, but they're already baked into an existing ownership paradigm. So I think the ability to reset categories with new offerings of ownership has the potential to be a transformational kind of shift.
Okay, next question is from Tiziano. How and when did you realize that your vision wasn't just crazy, but crazily good and worth to bring forward?
Well, I mean, I'll speak for both Kickstarter and say bentoism, because they're kind of similar. For Kickstarter, it was talking to creative people who are our friends, and hearing some skepticism, but by and large, when we talk to artists, they would say, "Oh, I'd use this. That's cool. I know what I'd put up on there." There was just an immediate connection of like, "Oh, I see how that's useful. Like, I'm down." With bentoism, I was working on the book when I had that idea, sort of like doodling it in my notebook, and I spent like a week or two really fleshing it out. I have a whole notebook I filled with like different ways it could go. And then I was living in LA, and I reached out to a friend of mine who she hosted salons talks in her living room often. And I just said, "Hey, can I do something for some people? I just want to test something out." And so she invited like 25 people over who I didn't know. And it was like the following week. And I just stood in front of people and I tried to explain it. And I'd made a 2-minute video or a 1.5-minute video of me drawing the bento and explaining it that I'd made myself. And I couldn't bear to say it out loud. So I just played the video in front of everyone while I hid in the corner, and I just watched people's faces. And afterwards I taught it and explained it more. And
did you get a standing ovation?
not a standing ovation, but people really liked it. And it was obvious. It was obvious people really liked it. And I honestly didn't know. And the crystallizing moment was this very macho, older Italian guy comes over and slaps me on the back and says, "You got some balls, kid." And I was like, whoa, okay. I don't know what I'm sharing here, but yeah. But it really was, it's like, it's feeling that body energy of like, I say this to another human face, I watch them respond. And like, I need that level of information trust to know that this is worth going forward with.
You know, I like this question from Tiziano because it opens up a deep level of very important thing, which most founders need to know. Am I really crazy? Is this idea ever going to take off? Because it's in most cases it's very hard at the beginning, and it goes on for a few years. And Kickstarter is helping that because if you bring a project to Kickstarter, you can quite simply and very fast see that this is something that resonates or it doesn't. Where would you personally advise upcoming founders to draw the line of when to give up or keep going?
That's a hard one. I mean, that's a hard one to know. I think that's a good bento kind of question. I mean, I did advise someone who I felt like should give up on something, but it's hard to say that to someone. It's really a thing you can only realize yourself. But I just tried to ask questions of like, it's difficult. A lot of what I see in doing like bentos and workshops, because I've taught the model in workshops to thousands of people at this point, and often what I see are people they're toiling with the question. They're now me and they're now us voices both say no, don't do it, you're not ready. But their future me and their future us voices say yes, do it. And inevitably it's like, I want to start my own business. I want to quit my job and do the next thing. And now says no, but the future says yes. And so they're stuck. They're stuck in like this sort of dreams deferred moment. And in those situations, what I try to help people do is I say, okay, great. This tells us a lot. So let's try to understand, what does your now me or your now us need? Is it a financial security that you need? Is it like a social security of having an approval from your partner? Is it just your own emotional needs? Like, what is it? Can we hone in on that? And basically you can start to get into like, okay, well, if not now, then when? What are the conditions that satisfy that for you? And let's make those the goal to work towards. Not the ultimate thing, but like, let's get to the place where you have satisfied what you are saying right now are your requirements. At that moment, you'll probably say, oh, it's not enough. And you'll try to move the goalposts again. But by doing this together, you're being accountable to it and we're making a plan. So the inverse of that is probably something like, if in 3 months, let's set benchmarks. Let's say in 3 months, this would be working if these things were happening. And let's set those things and let's agree to them. And then 3 months from now, if those things are not happening, let's be prepared to have a conversation no one wants to have. But like, we gotta be real at some point.
Okay, a question from Victoria Kostic-Nola. She wants to know, if you were not with Kickstarter or not a writer, where would you be? And what is the industry that excites you most apart from being a writer?
Well, I mean, where would I would be writing science fiction books is what I would be doing. The other industry I would work in, it's funny now that I'm seeing all these companies going fully remote, I'm like, oh, maybe I do want to work at a company again. It's nice to be a part of a team. It's nice to have shared impact. There's a lot of bullshit with it too, of course, but like, what I miss most about Kickstarter is the togetherness of being with the group. And so I think technology is a big place to make an impact. I mean, I think the environment is ultimately what matters the most. I mean, we're in this COVID crisis, which is just an appetizer for larger crises. And so that remains a critical issue. And that's something I've been very involved in for the past couple of years. But I'm optimistic about technology. I think we've emotionally turned against technology, and there is this hope that like technology will return us to Eden on a long enough timeline. Just the next patch and everything will be perfect. We've been telling ourselves that for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of years, and it will never be true. But I do think that I'm quite optimistic about the next generation of things to build,
Yes.
and I think there's a good energy coming together around them.
Okay. Question from Natalie. Natalie Beaumont. She wants to know, what has been your toughest day, and how did you overcome it? Do you remember?
Or yeah, well, I guess I didn't know, but a day popped to mind, so I guess I do know. It was towards the end of my tenure as CEO, and it was a day where I went to go to work, and somehow I was too tired to open the door. I said goodbye to my wife, and a couple minutes later, she walked by the front door, and I was still just standing there, and she was like, "What's going on?" And I, was just crying, and I just remember only saying, I just don't have the energy to go be that person today. And so I felt a lot of weight of being the CEO, being the leader, aware of how visible, how watched you are. Yeah. And that really wore me down. And I loved the job. I loved the people so much. I'm such a servant leader, being there for the people. That's what I'm there for. But it became very emotionally draining. After, 10 years of only putting myself all in on that, it really emptied me out. And that was hard because I've, always been kind of it was Perry's idea, but I was just always so present in the community. I was always kind of the Kickstarter guy, right? So so much of me is tied up in that. And then to reach a point of is this not working for me anymore? Was really hard. And that ultimately, was a part of the chain of events that led to me stepping down, maybe 6 months later, 5 months later, something like that. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Last question is, can you share with us some 2 or 3 books which influenced your life? Something useful which you recommend as a good reading?
Yeah. I read all the time. I love books so much.
I bet.
I would say The Entrepreneurial State by Mariana Mazzucato is fantastic. That's a very good argument for the power of sort of basic science funding and deep technological funding. It really explains why even the infrastructure of what we're doing right now, how it came to exist, which is pretty amazing to understand. It's not the story you think it is. A science fiction book, The Three-Body Problem, by Cixin Liu, Chinese writer, just tremendous, the most creative, imaginative thing you'll ever read. And then maybe one other, I think very helpful book for me was a book by a guy named Konosuke Matsushita. He was the founder of Panasonic and Matsushita in Japan. He wrote a book called Not for Bread Alone, which is a series of just reflections from his career. He wrote it in his 80s. He started his company as a teenager and led it for 50 some years.
I didn't know that. Interesting.
Yeah, and was always super progressive. He created the first 6-day work week in Japan, the first 5-day work week. He was just very, very wise. And so for me, while I was a CEO, I struggled with leadership mentors and heroes because most of what I saw didn't reflect, my value system. And so Matsushita, when I came across him, it was for the first time finding a real role model. So his writings have been incredibly important to me.
Nice. Yancey, the time is up. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, your insights. Maybe you can tell us, is there anything how we can help you?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I love to just, have people join the weekly bento is great. bit.ly/weekly bento. I also write an email newsletter, ideaspace.substack.com. I've got one today that's my first time sort of explaining bentoism for organizations. And I'll have an invitation for a free session for organizations interested in applying that to their challenges. So if this way of thinking is interesting to you, I'm talking about it often, mainly through email channels and through sort of Zoom chats and things that I host. So you're more than welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming, for being here, for sharing your wisdom with us. It was really, really insightful. I'll definitely come and check out the call and join you there.